Winter 1944. Deep inside Nazi-occupied France, a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen was almost ready to launch. It stood hidden beneath camouflage nets in concrete domes, a monstrous rocket designed not for the battlefield, but for terror. Hitler called it the Vergeltungswaffe 2, the V-2, a vengeance weapon meant to strike London from the edge of space, faster than sound, impossible to stop. It was the future of warfare, and it was hours away from rewriting history. But in the frozen fields surrounding the French village of Watten, a handful of men, ordinary soldiers, engineers, and pilots, were preparing for a mission so wild it sounded suicidal even to themselves. Their orders were simple but impossible. Find the launch site, destroy it, stop the weapon before it ever flies. What they didn't know was that they were about to carry out one of the most daring acts of sabotage in World War II, a mission that would erase a secret from the earth and change the fate of millions. By the summer of 1943, British intelligence began intercepting whispers of a mystery weapon under construction somewhere in northern France. A rocket, they said, powered by liquid fuel capable of flying 20 times faster than any plane. The reports sounded absurd. Even Churchill dismissed them at first as German bluster. Rockets? Guided missiles? It was science fiction, until photos from a reconnaissance Spitfire revealed something extraordinary. Hidden in the fields near the small village of Watten stood a vast complex of bunkers, concrete silos, and rail lines. It wasn't a normal base, it was a launch site, and whatever was being built there was enormous. The British code named it Operation Crossbow. Their goal? Identify and destroy Hitler's secret weapon facilities before they could become operational. But this site at Watten, was different. It was buried under meters of reinforced concrete, its roof thick enough to survive anything short of a direct hit from a battleship gun. The Royal Air Force had already bombed it dozens of times. Still, every time they flew over, the Germans were rebuilding. Each raid only made the site harder to destroy. Meanwhile, deep in the heart of Germany, the V-2 was being perfected. It was the creation of Werner von Braun, a young engineer obsessed with rocketry since childhood. His dream had been to explore space, but under Hitler, his vision became a weapon. A rocket that could climb 100 kilometers above the Earth and plunge back down at supersonic speed, carrying a 1-ton warhead. When it hit, there was no warning, no siren, no defense, just sudden destruction. British scientists understood what it meant. If the Germans could launch these at will, London could be leveled in weeks. Thousands would die, and there would be nothing, absolutely nothing, anyone could do to stop it. The only hope was to strike before the first rocket flew. That's when a different kind of war began. A war fought not just by soldiers, but by engineers, spies, and pilots. Every photo, every rumor, every intercepted message was a clue in a race against time. Somewhere beneath those French fields, the future was being built in secret, and someone would have to go there to destroy it from the inside. The man chosen to lead that impossible mission wasn't a famous general or an elite commando. He was a young RAF pilot named Jeffrey Stevenson, known among his squadron for his reckless courage and quiet focus. He'd flown dangerous low-level attacks before, but nothing like this. The briefing was short and brutal. The site at Watten had to be erased. Not damaged, not delayed. Erased. A direct hit on the main fuel bunkers or guidance towers might collapse the entire structure. But the mission would require a precision strike so low and fast that no one expected them to return. Stevenson read the orders once, folded the paper, and said only 4 words. "We'll get it done." On the night of August 25, 1944, as rain swept across the channel, the roar of Lancaster engines broke through the dark. Below them lay the invisible frontier between occupied France and the free world. Each pilot knew the risk. German flak guns surrounded the site. Searchlights crisscrossed the sky like white knives. If the rockets didn't kill them, the anti-aircraft fire would. But there was no turning back. The first V-2 was nearly ready. The countdown had begun. As the bombers approached Watten, the ground below erupted in tracers, red, green, yellow, slicing through the night. Stevenson pushed his Lancaster into a steep dive, the altimeter spinning. Through the smoke, he saw it. The massive concrete dome half buried, like a sleeping beast. He steadied his hand, ignoring the alarms, the burning smell of cordite filling the cabin. And then, just above the tree line, he released the payload. The bombs fell silently for a few seconds, and then the earth split open. Flames shot hundreds of feet into the air. One by one, the bunkers collapsed inward as their fuel stores ignited. The sky turned orange. In that moment, the launch site that had taken thousands of men to build was gone, erased in seconds. But Stevenson's aircraft didn't pull up. A flak burst tore through his right wing, sending the plane into a spin. His crew shouted over the intercom, trying to level her out. For a moment, they disappeared into the smoke. Command assumed the worst. But somehow, impossibly, the battered Lancaster re-emerged from the fire, limping back toward the channel on one burning engine. Behind them, the site was finished. The V-2 that was supposed to launch that morning never would. Stevenson and his men landed in England hours later, their plane half destroyed, their faces blackened by soot. They said nothing, only watched the sunrise from the runway as ground crews gathered around the wreckage. They had done the impossible. They had stopped Hitler's secret weapon before it was ever unleashed. When dawn rose over northern France, the smoke still hung thick above the ruins of Watten. From the air, Allied reconnaissance photographs showed only chaos, a cratered wasteland where once stood Hitler's most secret construction. The concrete dome, once thought invincible, was fractured like an eggshell. Every rail line, fuel depot, and guidance tower lay buried under tons of rubble. The engineers at Peenemünde, the heart of Germany's rocket program, received the report with disbelief. The site that had taken over a year to build, erased in one night. Inside the Allied command rooms in London, the reaction was almost silent. No cheers, no celebration, just a quiet understanding of what had been averted. For weeks, intelligence analysts had warned that the first V-2 strike was imminent. They'd estimated tens of thousands of casualties in London and Antwerp. The destruction at Watten had bought time, precious time. And time, in war, was life. But the mission's success came at a terrible cost. Several of the bombers never returned. Of the 12 aircraft that went in, 4 were lost without a trace. For the men who survived, the victory was shadowed by guilt. Stevenson, sitting on the edge of his bunk that morning, listened to the list of missing call signs over the radio. Each name was a man he'd briefed hours earlier. Each plane one more ghost in the gray dawn. He said nothing, just stared at the photograph of the Watten dome, now gone, and whispered under his breath, "They did it." The destruction was so complete that German crews arriving at the site could barely recognize it. Reports from captured documents later described the devastation as total annihilation. The underground fuel chambers had exploded with such force that entire sections of the facility were swallowed by the earth. Dozens of German scientists were killed, their blueprints lost forever in the fire. The Reich tried to rebuild elsewhere, in underground tunnels, in forests, in secret. But the blow at Watten had delayed the V-2 campaign by crucial months, and in those months, everything changed. By September 1944, Allied forces were racing across Europe. Every day, bought by sabotage and air raids, meant one less rocket that could fall on London. Still, the attacks eventually came. Over 1,300 V-2 rockets would strike the Allied cities before the war's end. But without the destruction of the early launch sites, historians estimate that number could have been 10 times higher. Watten, in its obliteration, had saved countless lives. For Stevenson and his crew, the mission became a quiet legend. One of those classified stories whispered only in debriefing rooms and among pilots who understood what wild really meant. There were no medals, no public ceremonies. The operation itself remained secret for decades, buried under reports marked top secret, crossbow operations. To the world, the launch site at Watten simply disappeared from maps, as if it had never existed. But the men who had flown that night never forgot. Each carried the memory differently. Flight engineer Thomas "Tommy" Ainsworth kept a piece of shrapnel from the mission in his pocket for the rest of his life. Navigator Bill Crane couldn't sleep for weeks afterward, haunted by the sound of the bomb bay doors opening, knowing that beneath them lay both destruction and salvation. They were not heroes in their own eyes. They were survivors of something too immense to fully understand. Meanwhile, British intelligence dug deeper. Inside the ruins, once the Allies advanced into France, they found what the bombers had truly destroyed. Rows of incomplete rockets, shattered engines, and burned fuel tanks. The size of them stunned even the most experienced engineers. 12 meters tall, armored in steel, powered by alcohol and liquid oxygen. The V-2 was not just a bomb. It was the first man-made object ever capable of leaving Earth's atmosphere. And yet, that miracle of engineering had been born from tyranny and fear. The same technology that would one day reach the moon was forged in the shadow of war, its first purpose to kill civilians from the sky. The men at Watton had unknowingly struck at the cradle of both destruction and discovery, and in doing so had reshaped the path of human progress. But for the airmen themselves, none of that mattered in the moment. They hadn't thought about space travel or the future of rocketry. All they knew was the mission, to stop the weapon before it launched. They had done that, and in the silence after the explosion, in the long flight back across the channel, each man carried a private thought that would never leave him. What if we had been too late? The answer to that question haunted them, even as Europe burned and rebuilt around them. Because the truth was simple: if the rocket at Watton had launched, history itself might have bent in another direction. The story of Watton didn't begin in the skies over France. It began years earlier, in the quiet, smoke-filled offices of British intelligence, with men and women who fought a different kind of war. Not with rifles or bombs, but with information. Long before Stevenson's bombers ever took off, a handful of analysts at Bletchley Park began noticing something strange. Intercepted German radio traffic kept referencing large shipments of special fuel and an unusual research facility on the Baltic coast, Peenemünde. It was here that Wernher von Braun and his team were designing the weapon that would terrify the world, the V-2 rocket. The British codenamed it Project Crossbow, and from that moment, the race to uncover and stop it began. At first, no one truly believed the scale of what Germany was building. The drawings smuggled out by Polish resistance fighters looked almost impossible. Rockets taller than houses, launched from massive concrete domes. But one young intelligence officer, Dr. R.V. Jones, refused to ignore the clues. A physicist by training, he had spent the war turning science into strategy, predicting radar ranges, decoding enemy technology, and finding patterns in chaos. He was the first to argue that Germany was preparing a new kind of weapon, one that could strike from beyond the atmosphere. Jones faced ridicule at first. His reports were called science fiction. Some even accused him of paranoia. But then came the photographs. The grainy black and white images taken by Spitfire reconnaissance pilots flying at the edge of their fuel range. In them, Jones saw something unmistakable: huge cylindrical structures, launch rails, and the distinctive curved dome that would later define the Watton site. The evidence was undeniable. By late 1943, he presented his findings to Churchill himself. The Prime Minister listened in silence, then leaned back and said, "We must stop these things at their source." And so Operation Crossbow was born, a vast secret campaign to destroy every trace of Hitler's vengeance weapons before they could be unleashed. It wasn't just bombers that carried this burden. On the ground, the French resistance risked everything to supply intelligence. In barns, in church towers, in the basements of occupied towns, they mapped German installations and smuggled blueprints out through underground networks. Many were captured, many never returned. But each message that made it to London added another piece to the puzzle and brought the Allied airmen closer to their target. By the time Stevenson and his men were chosen, the Allies had learned enough to know where to strike, but not how long they had. The V-2 could launch within days. That urgency drove every decision. There was no margin for delay. When the RAF destroyed Watton, they didn't just hit concrete. They shattered the spearhead of a weapon designed to break human morale itself. The Germans called the V-2 the vengeance of the Reich. It was meant to turn fear into victory, to make the people of London believe that no place, no street, no home was safe, to destroy not armies but hope. And that's what makes the mission at Watton something more than an act of war. It was an act of defiance, against tyranny, against terror, against the idea that technology could ever erase courage. Months later, as Allied troops pushed through France and into Germany, they would uncover the full extent of the rocket program, the underground tunnels at Nordhausen, where prisoners were worked to death building V-2s. The burned-out factories hidden in mountains, the rail lines leading to nowhere. Every site told the same story. Brilliance turned to brutality. In the ruins, a single V2 stood upright, blackened by smoke but intact. Soldiers stood beneath it in silence, realizing what it represented, the weapon of the future, born in the darkest hour of the past. When the war ended, some of those same scientists, von Braun among them, would go on to work for the United States, building rockets that would one day reach the moon. The technology that was meant to destroy cities would, within a generation, carry mankind beyond the stars. But none of that could erase what came first: the fire, the fear, and the men who gave everything to stop the weapon before it launched. For Jeffrey Stevenson, the mission remained his defining memory. He rarely spoke about it. When asked years later what it felt like to fly through the storm of flak and see the explosion beneath him, he said only, "It was light, then nothing, then silence." That silence, the silence that followed the destruction of Watton, was the sound of millions of lives continuing. Cities that would not burn, children who would wake up the next morning, a future preserved, if only by minutes. And that's what this story truly is. Not just about rockets or bombs, but about the fragile line between creation and destruction. About ordinary people who, in moments of unthinkable danger, chose courage over fear. Because history is not changed by those who plan for safety, it's changed by those willing to fly into fire, believing that something greater waits beyond it. In the end, the wild mission that stopped Hitler's secret weapon wasn't just a strike on a target. It was a reminder that in every war, the fate of the world can turn on the choices of a few, unseen in the smoke, fighting not for glory, but for tomorrow.